Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes? Matt here with YoVideogames, and I'm back with more of a real talk / news sort of video, and that was concerning some interesting stuff that came out earlier this week. And that came directly to us from Namco, who did a sort of a sales update. And again, like as we're seeing here, most companies' yearly financials end on March 31st. Like most corporate years start on April 1st and then go to March 31st. So we're seeing a lot of trickle out stuff coming out kind of like now, even though it's a little belated. And we saw how Nintendo's been doing, we saw how Capcom's been doing, and Namco's kind of drip fed some information out as well. And a big thing that came out this week was the overall sales of the last two Dragon Ball games from them and how incredibly high they are. Now, in the past, we had heard that the Xenoverse series 1 and 2 had sold about 10 million copies combined, right? Well, they kind of updated some of those numbers, and Xenoverse 2 alone has now sold 6 million copies, and Dragon Ball Fighterz, which is probably the most important news, sold 5 million copies, or has sold 5 million copies now. And that's pretty significant because guess what that means? That means that Dragon Ball Fighterz is now the best-selling versus-style fighting game of all time, which is pretty crazy to think because versus-style games have been around since the late 90s. But here we are today now with Dragon Ball taking that crown. And in the immediate kind of like gut reaction, well, of course, it's Dragon Ball, which is kind of underselling it a bit because if you go on Wikipedia, you can find many Dragon Ball games that have come out. Some of them even fighting games, and they didn't sell nearly that well. Hell, the last time Arc System Works did a Dragon Ball Z fighting game, it barely maybe cracked 50,000 units, and it probably never even got to 100,000. So to have this now, obviously things are different now because it's on like 4 consoles, well, 3 consoles and a PC, and it's just selling gangbusters now, and it looks really good, has lots of presentation, has a lot of post-launch support, but I think people are kind of underselling the whole accomplishment of this by just kind of writing it off as it's Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball will always sell, because that's factually not true. There's so many Dragon Ball games out there, Raging Blast 2, Sparking Neo, there was some like Limit Z or something like that, like the game right before Dragon Ball Xenoverse came out, that one, which was set in the Super Dragon Ball timeline. That cracked like 600,000 units. Like didn't even get to 1 million. So it's certainly no guarantee that these games are going to sell gangbusters just because it says Dragon Ball on it. But Xenoverse and Fighterz really tapped into something. Now there have also been other games such as, say, the Dragon Ball Budokai. Like Dragon Ball Z Budokai sold very well, like probably over 4 million copies, and during its whole heyday and run, again, that was on like 3 different systems as well and whatnot, had an HD re-release. So they've sold very well. There have been some games that sell really well, and there's been a lot of Dragon Ball games that don't sell. And the point is that it's not a license to print money, for like not a guarantee anyways, but looking at it, and I tweeted this out and it's got a lot of replies and feedback, was the fact that if we go by Capcom's own financial reports, we can look at Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which are listed separately, and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, and you combine all 3 of those games and you have about 4.8 million copies sold. And Dragon Ball Fighterz at 5. So now Dragon Ball Fighterz has sold more copies than Marvel 3, Ultimate Marvel 3, and Marvel Infinite combined. And yes, those are the best-selling Marvel vs. Capcom titles. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which was a re-release on the 360 PS3 and sold at obviously a highly discounted rate, about $20 or less, that only cracked 1.4 million copies. So even Marvel 2, which only had a good version on the Dreamcast originally and then had a kind of rather poor PS2 and Xbox port that were in very short supply, and the only time it ever got like a wide distribution release was on the 360 PS3, that only cracked 1.4 million copies. Like, there's a limit, it seems, to the success that's able to be garnered out of the Marvel versus Capcom versus Fighterz. And that kind of like goes into the question of why is Dragon Ball alone so successful at a versatile game than in any of the Marvel versus Capcom games. And some people, people like to just say, well, it's Dragon Ball, but you can't sit there and say Dragon Ball is obviously a huge franchise, but it's not bigger than Marvel. Like, Marvel as a whole right now is absolutely a bigger worldwide franchise than Dragon Ball is, even though Dragon Ball is huge. And that kind of like sits there and begs the question of, so why doesn't Marvel fighting games sell? And I think it actually goes a little deeper than just brand recognition or what have you. I think this goes into the fact that Dragon Ball lends itself to fighting games and action games better than Marvel does. Because Marvel as a whole is a whole lot of different characters, a whole lot of different storylines and properties and franchises, and they don't all lend themselves well to necessarily a fighting game. Now, Dragon Ball is at its core a franchise or series, an anime, a manga, if whatever you want to call it, or wherever you consider its origin point. It's a story about people punching each other. Like, at the end of the day, it's an ever increasing, power level increasing fight off. It's a tournament style thing. Like, even when it's not tournaments, it's still like a tournament. Everything is just sort of like, this guy's super powerful and this guy's super powerful and this guy trains to punch this guy harder, and then a new guy comes in and he's really buff, so the main characters have to get buffer to punch him back, or spirit blast him back. So at the end of the day, Dragon Ball just lends itself to fighting games much more naturally than even trying to throw all the Marvel characters together. And I think if you look at like the history of Marvel games, none of them have really not none, but there's a lot of Marvel games that even when they're not fighting games, they only do okay. You get a couple million out of the Ultimate Alliance series. Even the newest one, which was a Switch exclusive, it just cracked 1 million sales within the past year. Was not like some mind-blowing massive success. And like the most successful one of the most successful Marvel games, especially of recent memory, would be the PS4 Spider-Man. And that kind of also, jumping across the competitive divide there, we can also look at Batman Arkham series. And those are kind of like probably the best-selling superhero games in general. And I think that's because they work more towards the core Marvel audience. Not really just the core Marvel, the much broader Marvel audience. Because the reality is I feel like the overall Marvel fan or person who'd be interested in playing a video game based on Marvel characters is not someone who's interested in a competitive versus style game. They're kind of people who kind of generally just, yes, they want to be the Spider-Man, they want to be the Iron Man or what have you, but they're not necessarily interested in training themselves to become like a competitor in an esports like thing or anything like that. Just they're more interested in having that cinematic experience, for better or worse. And the PS4 Spider-Man game's fantastic, so are the Arkham games, so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it feels like doing a more cinematic, storyline-driven title is kind of more in the forte of Marvel versus Dragon Ball, which kind of retells the same storyline over and over and over again. But the fact of the matter is people enjoy the general setup of Dragon Ball, which is to get buff and punch something, punch a hole in the universe. It just lends itself naturally to what these are. So I think, just looking back at Marvel games as a whole, like, they've sold well sometimes, but overall they're not like a juggernaut in any one genre. And Dragon Ball Fighterz is a juggernaut for both for fighting games and for its subgenre of versus style fighting games. Is absolutely a juggernaut because the property it's based on, I feel, just naturally lends itself to it. So it's like a perfect fit. And I think this is kind of telling in a way where I think it's also a little worrying for Marvel Avengers, or Great Value Avengers, or Avengers, or Stunt Double Avengers, whatever you want to call it. The live services game by Square Enix and Eidos coming out in September. I'd actually be very concerned if I was any of the people involved with that game, because again, the general broader Marvel fan is someone who probably wants to play a game like PS4 Spider-Man, like Batman Arkham series, and they're not really interested in a ongoing, ever-changing, online experience that the Avengers has set itself up to be. So I think they're in kind of a pickle already, and also the fact that it's coming out at the literal ass crack end of the console life cycle, where most people are probably going to be looking forward towards the future. Obviously, it will probably work on PS5 and the Xbox, no problem. I'm sure, like, because they're all backwards compatible now. But it's still generally a bit of a concern, where it's like you want people to get invested and buy and invest time and money into a massive live service game, right, months before we start launching into the next gen. So that would be something I would definitely be worried about. And the real question is can Marvel versus Capcom, or Marvel in general, can they ever match up to Dragon Ball Fighterz? And I think that's possible, yes, but I think that window's probably slipped them by. Like, the best shot of a Marvel versus Capcom game getting to 5 million copies like Dragon Ball did would be to launch as early as possible on the PS5 and the Xbox. And not just launch early, but it has to look good, it has to have a roster, it has to have like a lot of positivity going into it. Like Dragon Ball Fighterz had a ton of positivity going into it when it was revealed and shown at E3 leading up to its launch. So the problem is, I don't think Capcom's anywhere close to that. Like, we don't really know what Capcom's doing right now, which is kind of funny. There's a lot of rumors about, like, other upcoming games that are not fighting game related, but we don't really know what the fuck's going on with Capcom. We especially don't know what the fuck's going on with them, with their fighting games. And I would guess, I don't think Capcom's anywhere close to, having a game ready for launch. But especially not a Marvel vs. Capcom 4. And that would have been the most important, most crucial, critical time to launch a Marvel vs. Capcom and have it be a huge success, is when have it be the first big versus fighting game for the new generation of consoles to get people excited for it. And that window's it's already long gone, because unless they had already been doing it for years, like, it's not happening for launch, obviously, or near launch or anything like that. So yeah, I think that the best shot Capcom had at redemption, and sort of reclaiming the Versus game throne, which Marvel vs. Capcom 3 had, which was only like 2.4 or 2.2 million. The best shot at reclaiming that throne from Dragon Ball probably has already passed them by, because they needed to do it within like the first 6 to maybe 9 months of the PS5 and Xbox coming out. So yeah, I think going forward, the future of Dragon Ball is probably still pretty bright. They're still releasing characters, to my knowledge. I still think there's a few more to come in whatever season they're on. I don't really follow the game, but that's to my understanding is that there's still a couple more characters to go, at least, for this season. And with 5 million copies sold, that's a hell of a lot of support. So can't imagine why you wouldn't want to use that. So yeah, all that being said, Dragon Ball's success doesn't necessarily surprise me, because it was just a perfect storm of the right developer, the right presentation, and the right timing to come out, and it just took off. And more importantly too, there was just tons of post-launch support, which, even an ugly game like Marvel Infinite never got any real post-launch support. It got like a tiny handful a couple months later, and then it was just like, see you later, bye. So yeah, that was pretty important as well. So there was just so many factors to create the perfect storm, which is what led, I think, to this amazing run of sales for Dragon Ball Fighterz. And I'm not even really gonna say I bought the game myself. I played it for about a month, and I put it back on the shelf. And to be frank, that's probably a good majority of people in the world who probably did buy that game when it released and played it for a little bit and gotten their enjoyment out of it, and then just probably haven't gone back. But I think having such great post-launch support, just constantly updating characters, that makes people turn their heads. It makes them turn it back on. If someone's a big fan of Jiren, they might be like, I really want to play as Jiren. I'll boot that game back up and I'll purchase that character, or I'll purchase that DLC pack. And Infinite didn't even get that chance. It didn't even have that opportunity to even try to sort of like salvage itself. Didn't have any post-launch characters, didn't have any updates or polish upgrades or anything. Just, and from everything I've seen and heard, that's pretty sad, because apparently the fighting system was rock solid in Infinite and the netcode was great. It's just, man, when a game looks ugly and doesn't feature the fighters you've grown accustomed to, and doesn't get any post-launch support, well, doesn't survive very long, does it? Oh well, that is what it is. But let me know what you guys think, and yeah, let me know down in the chat how you feel about it, and I will see you on the channel later, dudes.